Thank you for joining us. I'm Peter Bergen, Vice President at New America. It's really a great pleasure to introduce our guest, Steve Grove, whose new book, How I Found Myself in the Midwest, a memoir of reinvention, has just been published. Steve has a very distinguished career. He is the CEO and publisher of the Minnesota Star Tribune. Previously, he was Minnesota's Commissioner of Employment and Economic Development. He's had a career in Silicon Valley. He worked as the founding director of Google News Lab. He's also worked as an executive at Google and YouTube. He is a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also a New America Fellow. And so, Steve, we want to hand it over to you to talk about the big themes and big stories of your book. I will then engage you in a little bit of Q&A. I will also moderate audience questions. The audience should put those questions in the Slido box on their screen, and I will feed them to Steve as they come in. Thank you.
Great. Thanks you, Peter. Thank you, Peter, and thanks everyone for joining. It's an honor to be here today. And to be with Peter and the New America team is really a pleasure, and eager to hear your questions and share a little bit about this book that I just had released last week. It's the first time I've ever written a book. I've always kind of wanted to write a book, but had never quite put one together. And this unique moment that we're in Minnesota, in our country, kind of gave me a lane where I thought, I think there's something interesting to say here. And I thought I'd start by telling a little bit about my personal story, given that's what led me to write this book, and then talk about some of the bigger themes that I hope are resonant to all of you. So thanks for joining us. As I said, I live here in Minnesota. I'm in Minneapolis right now as we speak. It's where Peter Bergen himself was born, here in our fair city. Went on to much bigger and better things outside of the Midwest. But so many Midwesterners do leave and come back, which is a bit of my story itself. I was raised here in Minnesota, grew up in a town called Northfield, home to Carleton and St. Olaf colleges. Our town motto is Cows, Colleges, and Contentment. It's about as quaint as it gets. And I had great family and parents and enjoyed growing up in Northfield, but never remembered ever thinking I'd do anything other than leave. I don't know. That's just sort of what you kind of grew up thinking in our state. Not that Minnesota isn't a great place to live, but there's a big world out there. And when I did get old enough to take off for college, I did. This is sort of pre-internet, and California came calling for me. I went to Claremont McKenna College in my undergraduate years, really enjoyed it. And then spent some time after that abroad. I taught English in Japan for a year, spent time in Thailand and India. Did what I might generously describe as focused wandering. Didn't quite know, what I was going to be doing with my life after that, and ended up back, like any self-respecting 25-year-old, moving back with my parents at age 25 and living in their basement, trying to figure it out, frankly. And started writing for the Northfield News, the small local paper in our hometown, and really enjoyed it. Got to know my hometown in a different way. That led to the beginnings of a career in journalism that I think was kind of coming along for a couple of years until I discovered this site, YouTube, like many of us did back then, this kind of brand new video upstart. It was changing media dramatically at the time, and this is sort of pre-Facebook and pre-Twitter. And there was a YouTube video in particular that caught my eye and the eye of many others that captured a senator named George Allen in rural Virginia using a racial slur against his opponent. It was captured on camera, uploaded to YouTube, and went viral. And it became kind of the first ever viral political YouTube video. It was called the Macaca Moment. That was the racial slur that was not well known until then, but he had used. And anyway, it became this kind of larger commentary as it went viral on YouTube around his views on race. And many political commentators said it swung a very tight race towards Jim Webb, his opponent, which not only lost Allen his Senate seat by just a few small percentage points, in fact, I think less than 1%, but also moved the entire Senate from the right to the left. So suddenly, this website that had been created to share cat videos and dogs on skateboards was being used in a political way, which today seems so commonplace, but back then was just a big inflection point. So I came on board YouTube, early. I kind of wrote them a letter and was like, "How are you thinking about this? Do you have a political or news person?" And it was just a kind of a luck of the draw moment. They were, but they hadn't hired anybody. So I was employee 85 or so at the company and helped build a new political and news team. And this was kind of the utopia phase of the internet, a time when it was all upside. We talked a lot about, we use these fancy phrases like the democratization of the internet or the meritocracy of YouTube. We felt quite good about all the great things we were doing to level the playing field. And in many ways, we did some pretty neat things. We got YouTube users into, political debates to ask questions of candidates. We got, the President of the United States to do 8 successive interviews in a row using YouTube with YouTube creators and questions that we would surface. It was a unique time. And all along the way, I kind of built a career in Silicon Valley, and this dream of leaving the Midwest was kind of was being realized. I thought this is neat. This is really an exciting time to be in the Valley. I feel lucky to get to be on this rocket ship that I just kind of stumbled into. And my wife, similarly, who was a kid of a couple of Thai immigrants who came over and really built an amazing life for themselves here, but she was first generation, had found her way to Google and started a team focused on startups. We got married, and we had twins, and we thought, where do we want to raise our kids? And thought maybe there's a different place to do it. Should we think about the Midwest? And that kind of led to me coming back to my home state, a thing I didn't ever think I would do, but it's been incredibly rewarding. And for me, not only leaving Google, or sorry, leaving the Valley, but leaving Google, um, began a journey that was very different for me in the last several years, which is really the topic of the book. And how I found myself in the Midwest is both that story of how I found myself kind of back here in my home state, something I think a lot of people on the coast might think about or debate, but oftentimes maybe it doesn't make sense for them or they don't do. For us, it kind of did make sense and we gave it a swing. But then the second kind of meaning of how I found myself in the Midwest is how I found a little bit of who I am in this journey of leaving Google and joining state government, which is where I spent the 4 years after I landed here, working for Governor Tim Walz as the Economic Development Commissioner of our state during COVID, during the murder of George Floyd, at a really dynamic and challenging time that we can maybe talk about as we go further here. I'd say the subtitle of the book is a memoir of reinvention. It's about reinvention. That's a very American idea. Everyone watching here has had their moments of reinvention, I'm sure. For me, the shift from tech to government was a unique one. And as I started writing to friends back on the coast about what exactly it was like to lead a state government bureaucracy after working at Google, I started to think maybe there's something I could share here more broadly about community and reinvention. And so I thought maybe for this opening comments today, I could talk a little bit about what I learned about community reinvention because I think it's so important right now in America. We face a period of time where I won't be the first to say in venues like this that we have massive amounts of decline in trust in our institutions, a social fabric that feels like it's becoming a little unstitched, and of course the polarization that most recently we experienced in most tragic terms in Minnesota with the assassination of two of our political leaders. It's a challenging time, and it is unique to America, these trend lines, I think, in many ways, although there are some reverberations elsewhere. But I also think we get to choose the kind of communities that we want to live in, and the book really leans into that theme of community reinvention, I guess wrapped up in my own experience of coming to Minnesota and rediscovering myself in my home state through kind of the lens of a native son returned home. So I'll offer a couple insights on kind of community reinvention that I learned kind of leaving the coasts, going to the Midwest, leaving tech, going into government, and then now at the Star Tribune, where I'm the CEO and publisher, a new chapter, very local, that has felt different and very meaningful. I think that the first kind of lesson on community reinvention that is so important for this moment in particular is just that if we're going to reinvent our communities, I think we have to focus more on innovation than just efficiency. I think what you see in Washington right now and have seen over the past several months of the president and Elon Musk focusing on Doge and its efforts to make government more efficient, they are a response to a broadly held view that our institutions are failing us. I think if you want to give that the credit that it is due, I suppose you should, in the sense that we do need reinvention in our institutions. But I would say wholesale destruction probably isn't the best path forward. To me, government innovation is, I think, a really powerful and important way to reinvent our communities. And not just in government, but also in business and media and beyond. The hard part is we don't really give our major institutions a lot of slack to try new things. When I started in government, the very first day, they brought all of us government officials together. They gave us a little kind of 101 on how to be a government official. And the very first slide they put up on the screen was a goldfish in a bowl. It's just like saying, yeah, everyone's watching you. This is don't say anything that you wouldn't want to end up on the front page of the newspaper, which is good advice given the dynamic we live in, but it doesn't exactly inspire our government officials to bring fresh eyes and innovation to their institutions. What does create those opportunities is crisis. For us, the pandemic in Minnesota was a crisis that gave us a chance to try new things. We had to figure out entirely new ways to get unemployment insurance payments out the door. We worked with a bunch of young people to change a major law in our state that prevented high school students from receiving unemployment insurance benefits, even though they paid into that system. So it was this kind of old, antiquated law that took a lot of rethinking of how government works to fix. But a group of young people, along with bunch of other stakeholders, were able to convince both the Republican and Democratically led legislature to make that shift. So crisis kind of creates these opportunities. But I think also as a society, we have to give our institutions the chance to bring some of these innovations forward and create a space where government can try and fail a bit if we're going to allow these institutions to rebuild themselves. I think also when it comes to institutions, when it's business and the startup culture, you see a lot of innovation in Silicon Valley. That's sort of where I came from. But we need more tech ecosystems outside the coasts to do the big work of reinventing our economy. And in Minnesota and in many Midwestern states, you see that happening. I think oftentimes a far more purpose-driven way. Many Midwestern states boast having the highest business survivability rates of any states in the country, which is to say, if you start a business in the Midwest, it's more likely to be around in 5 years than any other place in the country because people pick stuff they care about and they're very purpose driven. And it sounds kind of Pollyannish maybe a little bit, but I think it's quite true in this state. Minnesota is one of the med tech capitals of the world. Mayo Clinic is here, of course. That name probably rings a bell to those watching. But it's also home to Medical Alley, which has the number one amount of med tech patents of any market in the country. So I think innovation has to happen in the business climate outside of just the valley, and I think you see a lot of it happening in markets like the Midwest. And for me, I got to see that through government, but also my wife. She runs a venture capital firm called Bread and Butter Ventures, where she's been able to invest in the very startups in the middle of the country that I think chart a somewhat different way than the ones that we see sometimes creating in Silicon Valley. A lot of innovation happening in Silicon Valley, to be clear. The rest of the country could use a little bit of that swagger, but I think the Valley could probably use a little bit of the sense of purpose that markets outside the coast bring. The second thing I'd say about community reinvention that you learn kind of when you jump from one sector to another, and I got to see it in government leaving Google, was just the importance of building bridges with people that aren't quite like you. And this is not some ground shaking insight, but I tell you, when you're in the field and you're doing it at a local level, there's a lot of possibility. I think we get caught up in this narrative, and there's a lot of truth to it about a polarized electorate, and certainly at a national level, you see the conflicts that are real. But it is a truism to be clear that when you go local, you just have a lot more reasons to connect and work across lines, right? You have to get the pothole fixed. You can't care about what the national political mood is, right? You have to get payments out the door to help your community. And I think at the local level, you oftentimes find the impact is a lot quicker to see. The polarization is a lot lower. Statistics will tell you that. And this kind of idea that Justice Brandeis lifted up so long ago of local politics being the laboratories of democracy turns out to be really true. At least I found that kind of leaving a national, global tech company and coming to a local opportunity here. That when you focus local, you can see a lot of real change. I think for us at Deed, the agency that I led for Governor Walz during the pandemic. We saw this happen all the time. And the murder of George Floyd really lifted this up, I think, in some really intense ways for our state, in ways that I think revealed a lot of paradoxes that a state that kind of has viewed itself so exceptionally has had to grapple with after the murder of George Floyd. But you saw a lot of people trying to figure out how do you drive a state forward to a stronger future in that moment. And one example I thought was really powerful was an entrepreneur named Jazz Hampton. He was working at a law firm. He was coming from a mixed race family. His father's black, his mother's white. He was a lawyer, but also a computer scientist. And in the wake of George Floyd's murder, thought, "Gosh, how do I contribute in some meaningful way to this tension that our state feels?" And so he started a company called Turn Signal. And Turn Signal is essentially a mobile app that you can have on your phone, and it calls in a lawyer to be on demand in a moment's notice over a video conference whenever you're in a situation that is escalating. And the most common use case for this is traffic stops. In Minnesota, this history we've had of huge gaps between whites and people of color in our state is oftentimes driven by these flashpoint moments, right? And getting pulled over by a police officer is one of them. And so Jazz created this app that is now used in all 50 states where on demand you can dial a lawyer in, which by the way isn't just to help the driver in a tense situation, but also the police officer. It creates a sense of safety, a third party there that's kind of, if nothing else, mediating, but also just there to answer questions. Um, Projects like that only work if the police officers are bought into them, if the entrepreneur can find ways to connect a community. And social scientists like Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone talk a lot about bridging social capital and bonding social capital. Bonding social capital is tight networks with people that are like you. Bridging is with those who are not. And both are important for communities to be strong, but I think it's that bridging social capital we need more of in the country right now, and that's something that I try to lift up a lot in the book. And then the last thing I would just say about community, reinvention, which I think is a topic that is not just relevant in the Midwest, but everywhere, is this idea of just feeling a sense of agency about all of it. I don't know about you, but I sometimes feel like the whole world's happening to us, right? Especially with the rapid growth in technology. There's a sense of like, my God, we can't keep up with it all. I even felt this working in a large tech company that, our innovations were happening so quickly that we couldn't keep up to their effect on society. A small example from a while back was during the Arab Spring at YouTube. We had all kinds of videos coming from Tahrir Square and elsewhere. And those videos were a powerful testament to what was happening there, but they also clearly identified the faces of those who were protesting, and in some cases led governments to make arrests using the same technologies these protesters are using to surface the news. We wouldn't develop a face blurring technology for several months after that. And so it's just one small example of the kind of cat and mouse game where you feel kind of technology is happening to you. I think today you're seeing a backlash to that. Certainly, technology's only gotten faster, and we can talk about AI and its effect on our lives. But we have to remember we are in the driver's seat on these things, that we get to decide the ways in which we want to use technology and the ways that we invest in our own physical communities. For me, this book isn't just kind of a cultural anthropological look at the Midwest or, Google the government, but also a personal story of moving somewhere in your 40s. I was 40 when I moved back, and I'd been gone for over 20 years. And I write a lot about, putting the phone down and trying to get involved in the community itself. Spent a lot of time finding a church, and for me that was a pretty big deal because I kind of left the idea of religion. It felt that it had kind of passed me by, and my own upbringing felt a little stifled on that front. And how do you invest in a church community in your 40s is something I write a lot about and was really rewarding to me, but challenging. And I write about that challenge. How to make friends in your 40s is, I think, a topic that not enough men talk about. 15% of men in this country will tell you they have no close friends, and half of Americans say they're unsatisfied with the number of friends that they have. So this epidemic of loneliness that I think is in part caused by technology's effects on all of us, which seem so powerful, but also allow us to kind of cocoon up, I think can be ameliorated if we get outside of our front doors a little bit. Um, and then, I think that the book is also a testament just to my relationship with my wife, Mary, and kind of a partnership and what it means to do something hard with somebody you love and kind of figure it out along the way. So, I think when it comes to reinventing your community, there's a lot of layers to it. There's a lot more ideas than I've just surfaced here, but the book tries to get at a lot of those, all in this lens of reinvention. And for me, my small story of reinvention is just one person's. I don't purport that it's the most fascinating one ever. Everyone in this call or chat and beyond has had moments of reinvention, but it's a powerful thing when you choose it. And I guess that's what I hope people take away from the book is that leaving something you're used to or comfortable with, like I did, leaving the Valley and going back to Minnesota, leaving Google and going into government, these were moves that were kind of jolting, and you can pretty easily have imposter syndrome. Like, gosh, can I do this? Can I actually leave this comfortable life I have and try something different? Or, can I lead a 1,400 person government bureaucracy? I mean, it's kind of preposterous. No one's really trained to do that. And especially you come from tech, which is different. But there's also superpower in reinvention. And whether you're changing careers or just changing approaches, when you try something new, you're putting on a different pair of glasses, and you bring something no one else brings by the virtue of not having been there before. And I think that's an underrated thing when you're shifting either careers or projects or what have you. And so I don't know, at a time when I think America needs a lot of reinvention and needs more people trying different stuff to kind of reboot and re-energize their institutions, I hope people take away from the book that it's possible, that reinventing yourself holds a lot of promise, that even though it's hard, sometimes the fact that it doesn't come with a playbook is the very thing that makes it possible to do because you can create your own. And, I've really enjoyed it. So it was a fun book to get to write. Honored to get to talk with you about it, Peter, and hope it resonates with people who are maybe looking for a message of hope right now at a time that can sometimes feel not so full of hope. So thanks for giving me the chance to share some thoughts about it.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Of course, reinvention is a very American thing. And a Minnesotan called Scott Fitzgerald wrote a
Yeah,
book called The Great Gatsby,
you
which is
did.
about reinvention in a lot of different ways. But a lot of things occur to me as you were sort of talking here. And one thing, and I don't know the exact stats on this, but a lot fewer Americans are actually reinventing things themselves. That fewer are moving that I think
Yeah.
do we have a sense of why that is the case and how long that's been going on, or?
I was surprised to find that out, Peter. I thought, man, in a world now where it's easier to move, mobility must be up. But in fact, the opposite is true. And
Yeah.
there's a great Atlantic cover story a few months back about why that is and sort of how mobility has shifted our sense of opportunity. Um, I think some of it is just the housing market itself making that harder to do. Affordability is a major driver. I talked to a lot of cultural anthropologists in the book who lifted up this idea that culture follows economics and that it's our economic system that makes that harder to do. Um, I
What,
hope
what,
more people.
what does that mean exactly?
I think that like the economy that we live in today is certainly different from the one you had many, many years ago. The nuclear family used to be the center of it all, and it was part of that kind of holding up an agrarian farmer economy that required people to live near each other. And then you shifted to this very different economy that had an opportunity in an industrial sense to move and middle class opportunities in a lot of different places that created more mobility. I think what this moment is lifting up for mobility is a little bit different. There is, in some sense, a chance to have opportunity everywhere, but also the internet and virtual opportunities mean you don't have to necessarily go somewhere to have a job there. And so there's some kind of countervailing forces. Um, and then I think, but I think the larger point, honestly, on culture following the economy, and this is the thing I'm maybe more concerned about, is that our economy today is so virtual based and so less based in the physical attributes of community that I think the culture suffered a little bit from that. And I talk about that, a bit in the book where human ties that happen in more physical environments, the bowling alone thesis, if you will, has had a degradation effect on sort of our sense of belonging in community. And I don't think that's an inevitability, but it takes a little bit more volition to fight against.
And then there's kind of another phenomenon, which is geographical sorting. So, I mean, you
Yeah.
live in Minneapolis, right? Which I think of as being a pretty liberal environment. Um, I was very interested in a book called Connected, which kind of it makes the point. It was based on pretty big data sets, and it says something that may be wildly obvious, but it really struck home with me, which is we're totally victims of our own environment in terms of our beliefs. We think we have independent political beliefs, and maybe we do. But in fact, if you look at where people live, you're almost definitely going to know what their political views are. And then relatedly, because I wanted to ask you a sort of related question, which is, and I don't know the data on this either, but my impression is the people who leave to go to the big city, wherever it is, they're basically now Democrats, and the people who stay in that, whether it's rural Louisiana or rural Minnesota or pick your state, are more likely to be Trump or Republicans. And so that's another form of geographical sorting. Is that correct?
I think it is to some degree. I think that there are some nuances to it. Of
Yeah.
course, we find in Minnesota, for example, demographic trends lift up that people who then have young kids, like rural populations grow with families moving back to them once they want to live in a rural environment. And polls will largely show you people at least say they want to live in a small town. Whether they actually do is another question, but there's that kind of American sensibility of, hey, I'd love to raise my kids in a small town. But I am worried about the geographical sorting and what that says about our politics and our economy. You look at the amount of venture capital funding over the last 10 years that's gone to states that were won by Harris and Walz versus states that were won by Trump and Vance. And I think it's something like over 85% of the venture capital went to states, won by Democrats. This is a Rise of the
Huh.
Rich study that Steve Case and his team put out. So um, it's no wonder that we have this sense of grievance and opportunity gap that is out there that maybe leads to some of the political discontent that you find. So I think it's there. I think Minnesota, just to speak to the Midwest for a moment, is a state that has found ways in the past, at least, to create ties between urban and rural that are somewhat unique to our state. I won't give you a whole history lesson on it, but there's a pretty good connection of St. Paul and Minneapolis investing in rural communities through infrastructure and sewer. Minnesota has the fourth most highway miles of any state in the country overall. And so we've had this sense of connectedness. We have the Minnesota State Fair every year that brings us all together in this giant block party. But even that is taking its hits over the last 5 years, and COVID kind of exacerbated some of it. And the politics of our own state have shifted in urban and rural markets too. So I think people do tend to sort, no doubt, and some of the tools and technology that we have today makes that easier. Um, but I find it a lot richer to be around people of a lot of backgrounds personally. I mean, when I was at Google and Trump won in 2016, we had to like commission a study to figure out what had happened, right? But if you're living in a purple state like Minnesota has been, now Minneapolis is blue, but the state's purple, you you see Trump lawn signs everywhere, right? So you have a bit more of a sense and a pulse. It's a bit less of a bubble, but it takes a bit more work today, I think, to your point, to make those connections outside of your own narrow political communities.
Which brings me to the sad topic of your colleague, Melissa Hortman, who was killed, or assassinated essentially for political reasons, along with her husband. What was your connection to her? Tell us a little bit about her and what happened and what does it say? Sort of parenthetically, it seemed to have received much less media attention than
Yeah.
it really merited, partly because we live in this very busy news environment.
Yeah. Well, this was just a little over 2 weeks ago, and as I'm sure listeners, saw, it was just a brazen midnight political attack that assassinated both Melissa Hortman, the former Speaker of our House, and her husband, and then attacked another legislator, Senator John Hoffman, and his wife Yvette, and then the same assassin tried to attack two other houses. Just shocking. I don't know. There's no other word to put it. It's been only a little over 2 weeks. The funerals were just this last weekend. And it's devastating. I mean, I did know Speaker Melissa Hortman. I worked with her when I was in government. She was every bit the kind of exceptional political leader you'd want to have. Just to give you a sense, she's someone who guided both the House and the Senate through, divided legislatures to pass some really meaningful legislation. And 2 sessions ago, passed probably the biggest and most advanced progressive agenda that any speaker has ever passed with a really deft political touch. But that might make you think that she was just a progressive champion. She was a very, really, really pragmatic leader too. Most recently, with a House deadlocked with the exact same members on the left and the right, she actually gave up the speaker's gavel to her opponent to try to find a way to move forward and brokered a power sharing agreement that got a budget passed. And then 2 weeks later, this assassination. It's devastating and it's heartbreaking. I think Minnesota is a place that has long viewed itself a little bit above average on all levels, if you will. There's a sort of exceptionalism here. Garrison Keillor's quote about all the men are good looking, all the women are strong, and all the kids are above average is something we kind of secretly believe. And there's some statistics that bear out Minnesota does punch above its weight. I won't recite them all, but back in my economic development commissioner days, I had a whole pitch on this because it's, we are a unique spot, a progressive and uniquely uh, successful state in the middle of the country. But that's been a bit hit by this really, really tragic circumstance. We're still all grappling with what it means. But I think you're right to say that the media cycle has moved so fast. And the very next few days after this, we're, dropping bombs in Iran and people move on. And I worry, as I think many do, that this sort of political violence is normalized to the point where it's like, oh yeah, and then that thing happened in Minnesota. Oh yeah, and then that thing happened over here. We just kind of get almost immune to it, or at least we come to expect it. And I think we can't do that. We have to stop and remind ourselves this isn't normal. This shouldn't be happening.
Well, I wonder though, Steve, if it actually might be normal. I mean, I'm just thinking about in the long sweep of American history. I mean, A, we've had multiple presidents who've been assassinated. B, Senator Sumner was almost beaten to death on the floor of the Senate about at the beginning of the Civil War. Maybe there was an interregnum during the Cold War when we kind of this sort of stuff subsided. But I think actually the history of political violence, and they were born in a revolution and a civil war,
Hmm.
60s. I mean, it just, maybe this is kind of a reversion to, we grew up where this was not normal. But, maybe this is a reversion to something that is unfortunately is more part of America than given the, all the obvious things like you know, the polarization, the availability of weapons. I mean, that, and the kind of conspiracy theories that are weaponized on the internet. It just, this might be the new normal. I'm not advocating for it, obviously, but I'm just wondering.
Well, I think your history is right, and it's a good point. It shouldn't be normal is the better thing to say,
Yeah.
or maybe compared to other nations, it's not normal. I think certainly it is an event here that felt very much out of step with how Minnesotans view themselves and how we view this as a state that has had a really unique tradition of bipartisanship. It's a state that has had the most successful third party in the history of American politics with a farmer labor party that brought together rural farmers with urban laborers to create a coalition that elected three Minnesota governors, several national politicians and local ones too. So I think our sense of identity in this state has been very wrapped up in the sense that we get things done and we don't resort to violence and polarized rhetoric. But I will say, having been the deed commissioner, which is the jobs commissioner in our state during the pandemic, you saw a somewhat different tone. I mean, traveling the state to advocate for mask usage was a little bit harder than I might have expected, in those times, as it was for any state government official, during that unique window. So something's shifting. I do think we get to choose the kind of society that we want to have. I think the unfortunate thing about political violence, as sociologists will say, is that it is in some ways has been very effective over time, and so people choose it because it makes a point. But we're better than this, that's for sure. I think we can all agree on that, and we have to believe we're better than this, or we don't create the kind of conditions where it happens as often as it does. But we're still digesting it here. It's been a rough few weeks.
Yeah, no, it's really a tragedy. And of course, President Trump was a subject of two assassination attempts, one
He
very
was.
serious.
He was.
And Steve Scalise of Louisiana was very lucky to be alive. He was the he was the number three in the House when he was ambushed by an anti-Trump kind of zealot at a baseball game. So I mean, it is unfortunately that this is the environment we now live in.
Yeah.
If you're back in the day, being part of the Capitol Police was kind of a rather sleepy job. Well, think about January 6th and all the different, and Nancy Pelosi's husband, and
I
the
know.
threats that are coming in. It's a very different political environment, and I would think it would dissuade some people from going into political life. I mean, you made the decision to go into political life, and I wanted to ask you about your colleagues. So you went to the Kennedy School. It's the School of Public Policy.
Right.
Were you? I mean, I taught there for a term which I really enjoyed, and the students were just kind of amazing, and I'm still friends with some of them. And you know that the quality of people there is first class. But I wonder how many of them actually went into local government like you did, because
Yeah.
tuition is that you might have been an outlier, but I could be completely wrong.
Yeah, I think you might be right about that. I mean, I have several former classmates, it's been 20 years now,
Yeah.
who did go into government, but most of them, like the State Department
Right.
or
Yeah. I mean, they went into the federal government.
right,
They didn't
federal
go into.
government. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very few into local government. I think sometimes you see local government officials do like 1 year mid-career programs at places like the Kennedy School. But I think your broad point is right, that most people don't think about local government as a place to invest time. I guess, you know, to me, even before these events happened, it seemed like a worthy thing to do and an exciting thing to do and a thing where I could see the impact right in front of me. Part of Google, which is so great, is you're working in this global company and you shift one pixel here and it affects the whole world. And I remember when we, built the YouTube video uploader on a mobile phone for the first time, the engineers that were working on it, were excited to launch this to the whole world. And it was this massive shift in how you upload a video. And they realized a few days later that about 18% of the videos were upside down. And they realized that they forgot about the left-handed people who would turn their phone this way versus turn their phone this way. And so, just working at that scale is fascinating, right? And so and intoxicating. But local and government has, I would argue, even more impact on your neighbor's day to day, and the tangible feeling of, say, getting an unemployment insurance check in someone's, bank account so they can feed their family, or helping a small business kind of stem the tide during COVID mitigation and pandemic restrictions was really meaningful to me. So I hope more people do it. I think events like the ones we've seen here are a dissuasion, right? And certainly at the federal level, the polarization we see and kind of the demonization of public service doesn't help. There's a lot of things to say don't do government service right now. I would argue uniquely, though, that local government service is still a really rich place to invest your time. And I hope more people from outside the field do it.
Well, see, picking up on, I mean, I'm sitting here in DC. I mean, what is particularly galling about, you mentioned earlier, I think, the kind of the cuts that, but what is particularly galling for me and for like, a number of people I know have lost their jobs or their sectors have been turned upside down, is they've been demonized for no good reason. I
Yeah.
mean, sure, there's always going to be somebody who's like corrupt or on the take or like screwing up. And I mean, that's true of anything. But whole sectors, if you think about Carrie Lake's public statements about Voice of America, which is, a bunch of people earning not that much money who've all lost their jobs more or less completely, except the ones that speak Persian because they're for the moment they're needed. You know, I but it's a very unfortunate situation. I mean, there's always been the demonization of government, and this we were formed as the United States was formed as a sort of anti-government, anti-empire project, but it seems to have got much worse. And there was during Reagan era there was certainly a sort of discussion of the government being a problem, and of course the government is problems, but this seems a lot more intense.
Oh, it's way more intense. And I think there's this kind of very easy archetype of the bureaucrat who doesn't do anything, or the paper pusher who blocks things, or the inefficient government process that is annoying, or you're on hold with the DMV, or you name it. Like there's that kind of archetype out there of government, the customer service experience with government. And so there's this kind of national mood of frustration. And I think just a lot of discontent in the country where it's very easy to blame government for it. And so painting, though, the entirety of the federal bureaucracy with that kind of brush, and therefore eliminating incredibly dedicated and talented public service servants from jobs that do fundamentally important things, not just outside of our front door, but globally to ensure our security and has for the last 20 years, I think is reckless. And it's a shame to see. And I think I have friends who've lost their jobs and people who've, had to question their whole career trajectory because of this shift. And um, it's a shame because I think it's akin to sort of seeing one thing that's wrong and then applying it to the whole of an agency or an effort, and not seeing that in fact, yes, change is needed, innovation is needed. I'll speak for myself. Coming inside of government, coming from Google, this kind of culture of innovation where you come into local government and expect that you'll see a lot of we called them weebies when I came in. I was told this, that you call somebody who's been in civil service for a long time a weebie. Weebie here before you were here and weebie here when you leave. Kind of a silly name, but like it kind of sticks in Minnesota anyway. Um, I found a lot of people who really wanted to innovate. They just didn't have a pathway to do it. There was a lot of good ideas in the bureaucracy. There's a lot of people inside of government who, I mean, almost everyone who does it has a sense of purpose and cares. And then there's a lot of good ideas, but the avenue to generate them and lift them up is harder. One of the things that we did at the agency that I really found useful is create an innovation lab. We're not the first ones to try it. You see them in a lot of institutions, but we looked at all the best practices and created a space where the very civil servants who wanted to have a better agency were able to try new things with a little bit of air cover for failure. Not on the big stuff, because you can't have unemployment insurance fall apart, but on stuff where you can make some real meaningful change. I wish that the federal government's approach, the Doge's approach, had a bit more of that in it right now than it does, because you're going to turn a lot of good people away. And if this is a country where, as our founders kind of lifted up, you want people to kind of come in and out of government, right? To be in the private sector, then go do some time in government, then leave and kind of bring those skill sets in and out. It just looks a lot less attractive to do when you're worried about your very job existing. And so I don't think it's an approach that's going to strengthen these institutions, frankly.
Question from from the audience, which is related to what you were just talking about, Steve. What do you think government can learn from tech and vice versa when it comes to responding to emergencies or community needs?
Yeah. Well, I think government can learn a lot from tech. To this point in innovation, I think Google and many other companies like it have survived and thrived multiple iterations of their future because they built cultures where new ideas were welcome. And I think government has to find the right ways to do that and make that feel safe. You need a little bit of public stakeholder engagement on that front because governments don't operate in the same kind of vacuum as sometimes private tech companies can. But I think there's something to be learned about how those efforts are set up and how they grow. I would say that though, tech and Silicon Valley can learn a lot from government though too. I mean, one of the things that I learned really quickly coming into a state government bureaucracy is the importance of like stakeholder and stakeholder management. And it sounds kind of very cheesy, but like my job often was just to like make sure all of the different factions in a given issue were like consulted and talked with. And in tech,
Right.
you're moving so fast at Google, you're not consulting 50 stakeholders, you're trying to beat the next guy. And this is not just in tech, but elsewhere. I think that better technologies would be created if a bit more of a stakeholder driven approach took a beat to consult those your technologies affect before you launch them. That's something I think tech can learn from
Well,
government.
that raises a really interesting question. I don't normally find myself totally agreeing with Josh Hawley, um, but as a parent of children, and you have two 8-year-old kids, I think, right?
Yeah,
Twins.
I do. Yeah.
And we have a 13-year-old and 11-year-old. I mean, what Josh Hawley is saying, what I guess in Australia they banned the use of social media for people under the age of 16, which I think is actually quite sensible.
Hmm.
But this really gets to the question of stakeholders. I mean, these tech companies are they're the richest companies in history.
They are.
Their
They are.
stakeholders are like the human race. and yet they seem the cycle. I'll give you a kind of concrete example. You worked at YouTube, and then my first experience at YouTube was talking to Neil Mohan and
Oh yeah.
about ISIS videos, and that was really an
Mhm.
for YouTube and trying to take them down and act in a responsible manner. But there was often a cycle with any, I think, tech company, which is we come out of this slightly, California, the government is over there. They shouldn't get in our business, and that's kind of like the mindset. But then you're operating things that operate like public utilities, even if they're not paid by the
Yeah.
government, and how you square these responsibilities is an interesting question. And I understand, look, YouTube, I don't know, you probably know the answer to this. When I saw Neil Mohan and Will McCants, which was like over a decade ago, they said, well, we have 400 hours a minute of TV coverage being uploaded.
Yeah. Yeah.
Problem. Now let's assume that's like 40,000 and the numbers are insane. But how do you think about the responsibilities that these companies have, to the public, for the content that they put out, and particularly when it comes to kids?
It's a huge responsibility. It's a huge responsibility. And it was, I guess telling to me when I was at YouTube and working in the Valley that many of the executives at the company were actually ahead of contemporary society and trying to hold their kids back from watching too much YouTube because they saw the effects that it would have. And the creation of YouTube Kids, I think, came from a very real sense of people within the company seeing that that was a needed avenue and needed platform to create. Look, I think your point on these companies being a public utility is a really good one. If they're going to be a civic good, you have to, or at least a civic platform, you have to look at them through that lens. And that means different kinds of regulations and approaches than we currently have today. They're private companies. They're in a race to innovate. They're going to do what's best for their bottom line. And I think there are many great people that work at these companies. Many of them are still my friends. And I think
Yeah.
Google, I would say, is uniquely somewhat different than the others in the sense of its mission is really about information and access to it. But they're in a race, and without the right guardrails for it, we're not going to get this right as a society. We do get to choose that. The challenge with this right now is that I think many legislators and those in Washington and elsewhere, just it's hard to keep up with the technologies themselves. And so creating actually a thoughtful set of regulations can sometimes be like two ships passing in the night. And I think I was related to the news space where our whole existential existence as the Minnesota Star Tribune is threatened by some of these platforms if we don't find the right mechanisms to support a business model for journalism in the future, we're going to continue to see a trend where the advent of these technologies has led to two out of every three journalists in this country leaving the newspapers they work at over the last 10 years. I mean, it's just astounding
Well,
how that has
now you're
happened.
now you're going to get on one of my hobby horses, because I'm sure we're going to be in violent agreement, because AI is based on theft. I mean, let's be clear. I have the Atlantic did a very useful piece early on showing the 183,000 books that OpenAI had kind of built its model on, two of which happened to be written by me, and
Mm.
anybody who is a writer can go and check. So it's based on theft, and no one asked my permission or any of the, this thing just happened. And as well know, there is the New York Times is suing OpenAI so that they can't just steal all their property, intellectual property. At the same time, some companies have said we're going to take the money, because for the sort of some of the reasons you've alluded to, which is it's kind of a difficult choice. We
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is. It
but
is.
the other thing is AI itself gets dumber if it doesn't have access. So you run a news a daily media enterprise.
Yeah.
So if AI, when people make an AI inquiry, they do want to know typically stuff. They don't, sure, they might want to know some detail about medieval history, fine. But often they want to know something about that it's current. And the AI gets dumber if it doesn't have access to current information. So, without putting you on the spot, I don't know how you as a CEO and publisher of the Minnesota Star Tribune are thinking about this, or you don't have to comment if you don't want to, but we just comment more broadly. But it just seems like the news business has gone through two versions of this already, where essentially we committed Harry Carey. There's no business in history that survives by giving away its product.
Yeah. Right.
And so we're now at another inflection point, and it seems like no one really knows what to do, and the people that are running these companies don't give a shit in terms of, like, sorry, pardon my French, but they're going to take what they can. And by the way, the other thing which is very interesting to me is these companies employ very small numbers of people. It's not like, relatively speaking, they consume vast amounts of electricity and water, so they're environmentally not very sort of desirable. And it's not like they're a huge employment opportunity, and yet they create vast amounts of profit for themselves. So, and I don't mean this as an aspersion on them personally. I'm just like, this is the situation we're in. But I think we've been here before in the news business. So how do you think about what we should be doing?
Yeah. Well, this is the existential threat that any journalist or news organization or publisher faces right now, which is, how do you navigate this moment? And how do we as a society navigate this moment for, a marketplace that needs to have rich, fact-based journalism, great literature and books, and an economic model to support it? I
Yeah.
think the challenge in some ways with AI is that it's coming at a time in which the economic model was already teetering, right? You already had a space where the ad model that funded journalism forever has just vastly shifted to the big tech platforms. And then even news habits in general and the sort of apathy against subscribing or actually paying for news, the sense, especially in younger generations, the news should just find me, was already making this kind of a headwind rich environment. And then, of course, AI comes to your point where why click through to a blue link on a search results landing page when the answer is right there for me? So,
Well, then that I hadn't not really considered that until very recently. That is going to, and this is really a problem because one way that you could survive was through having Facebook kind of recommendations or blah blah blah. But now you unpack that a bit for those who may not be following it as closely as you are.
right. I mean, look, in a digital environment, we're no longer dropping the news printed on a paper on your doorstep. We need people to come to our platforms. And, yes, we want to build a kind of brand where people will bookmark startreviewing.com and come to us every day. But the media habits of today's consumers have shifted, and we're more likely to find at least over half our traffic through referral sources. And, Meta and other social platforms have withdrawn from those efforts pretty heavily. Twitter's become something of a cesspool, you might say, at least in some corners of it, anyhow. And then, again, Google's business model, I think, is to their own interest needs to shift too. So all these trends are hitting again at a time when it's teetering. And in fact, if we don't find ways to get people to our content through these third-party platforms, it's just harder to generate that kind of loyalty. So,
Is one approach for you sort of hyper local?
oh yeah,
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of that. I mean, our major initiative this year is high school sports.
Yeah,
And,
right.
and it's hugely promising for us. I mean,
Well, yeah, because people are really interested.
they're super interested. President Taft's grandfather was a newspaper publisher in Ohio, and his business theory was the following: just make sure everyone in town's name is in the paper once per year, and you'll win, right? And so I guess high school sports is kind of our version of that, where you'll buy a subscription if your kid's in the paper. But we have to do it in a unique way using technology. We're going to launch a whole platform called Strib Varsity. Strib is what people call the Star Tribune here. Strib Varsity this fall that leans into the hyperlocal stuff. You got to be more targeted. I think this idea of a generalized local news bundle that people will purchase out of a sort of general sense of civic awareness is faded a bit, and you need to target. So we're going deep on the outdoors, deep on high school sports, deep on, food and culture, and we're seeing some growth there. But back to your point on AI, if we aren't wearing two hats at once, one hat being the kind of regulator, political hat, and the kind of licensing negotiation hat, alongside the other hat of like, how do you innovate with these technologies and how do we use AI rather
Yeah.
than kind of as most news organizations did in the early days of Web 2.0, kind of issue social or think to your earlier point that the internet's just a marketing device, then we're going to get passed by. So the thing I worry about is, even for us, it's hard to hold that many things in your hands at once,
Yeah.
such as executive bandwidth in a news organization. And we're the largest newsroom in the Midwest. So if you're a
Oh,
smaller publication, even a mid-size, it's all the more hard. And where you pick your shots in that frothy environment, I mean, I'll just cut to the chase. I don't think that journalism in this country survives simply on a subscription model. We're going into philanthropy right now. I would argue that some of the statewide programs you've seen in California, Illinois, New York to drive public dollars into media in ways that are safe and don't influence coverage are going to be essential because back to your point on the public utility piece, in the same way tech platforms are that, so are newspapers. And if we value them as a public good, we got to fund them in a way that recognizes that. And it's going to take some kind of shifts in how we as Americans think about the media, but I think it's essential for survival.
I wonder if that's a little bit back to the future. I mean, nobody went into the newspaper publishing business in the 19th century necessarily to make a lot of money. Typically, they had made some money and then they bought a newspaper to influence.
Right, right.
But let me ask you another question from the audience. Now that you're at the Star Tribune, how do you see the role of journalism in bridging divisions or restoring trust?
Yeah, I see it as essential, and the data will prove to you that in markets that have dense local news ecosystems, you see lower polarization, higher voter turnout, more donations to
Uh,
philanthropy. I mean,
that's
and this
fascinating.
is, yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's not just a feel-good anecdote. The science bears it out. So I think it just having the news there is important. But I also think I just speak to again the last few weeks here in Minnesota, we've been grappling with a state over these horrific murders. Having a platform that really leans into voice and lifts up perspectives from legislators who knew Melissa Hortman and her husband or others who have perspectives in this moment has helped us all try to wade through the unthinkable in a way that I think only a large regional news organization that has this audience scale that we do can do. So I really believe journalism is ultimately public good and is about finding connections between people. In some ways, just having a common set of facts, but also through giving a platform for us to navigate them.
Yeah. New America, answering some of the questions that came from the audience and some of the, we got into the technology space very, very early on and set up
I
Open
know.
Technology Institute. And, a couple of things that we've done, I think, that are useful innovations, which maybe you can comment on whether or not you know the details or not. One was we set up something called Tech Congress, which is now spun off, which was basically putting technologists in the offices of congressional
Yeah.
members because there was this kind of like gap between the responsibilities they had and their knowledge of what the actual issues were. So that was one idea. And the other one is what Anne-Marie Slaughter, the CEO of New America, is called public interest technology. So similar to the idea of lawyers operating in the public interest and making that a career, having technologists sort of do that and also embedding themselves in particular projects and doing sprints in particular areas. We have somebody, Tara McGinnis, runs this for us at New America,
Yeah.
and she's really been able to scale up some of this, taking on like massive projects. Like, I think her goal is to connect 3 million families to the programs that can actually help them, because a lot of people don't really understand how to access the programs that could help them. But anyway, so are you aware of, not leaving aside New America for a minute, but I mean, like around the country, is there more effort to integrate technologists into government? Speaking of somebody who came from that sphere.
Yeah, you've seen it circumstantially when things go wrong. Like you think of like healthcare.gov getting fixed by a
Right.
bunch of engineers that headed to DC. So I think sometimes you see it in these kind of crisis situations.
Yeah.
But I do think that the original work that Jen Paulka and team did with the digital office and federal government was a model for a lot of people and got us off to a good start. And
And isn't that the office that Doge essentially took over?
it is. So it's kind of a tragic about face these last 6 months, but it
Yeah.
did set a model, this digital office and government for engaging, giving a lane, right? Because I think a lot of times if you're in technology, like where would I go? Like what would I? You need a bit of a Sherpa, if you will. And so
Yeah.
programs like the one that Tara runs are a great example of that. I think there are others. I wish there were more though, because I think I talked to a lot of people when I worked in technology who kind of like when I told them I was coming to state government, oh, that's really how did you do that? Like how do you even evaluate? And of course, the salary gap. There's a lot of reasons it's hard. But I think this idea of these like stints are really powerful. When I was in at Google, I had a chance to do a 3 month sprint with the State Department and Rick Stengel over at the Public Diplomacy Office under Megan Smith to figure out how to counter ISIL's propaganda machine.
Mm.
Luke Hardig, one of your colleagues and friends,
Yeah.
helped lead it for us, and he brought kind of five of us into the government and said, get some outside brains here, but just 3 weeks. Help us figure out like how you would counter this propaganda messaging machine and what you do at the State Department to help shift this a bit. And we spent a really powerful 3 weeks. We got to present in the Situation Room at the end. It was a really powerful experience for us
Did
personally.
you need a clearance to do that, or were you able to do it without a
We
clearance?
we did it without a top security clearance. We had, I think, a level of vetting that was done in each of us.
Right. Well, but that's kind of good because otherwise the whole thing would be take so long. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
and ISIS is not operating on I mean, they're operating in the clear, right? So
But as a credit I think instances like that exactly are like when you come in for a sprint, it ended up creating the end. The recommendation helped fuel the creation of the Global Engagement Center, which for the last 5 or 7 years, varying level of success, but it's tackled this problem in a slightly different way. So I think that's it too, is where you can find angles to bring people in for a short chunk of time, but sometimes it's more accessible. And I found that to be really meaningful. And I'll be honest, that was part of what said, okay, maybe government is a place that can make a difference longer term, or at least for longer than 3 weeks.
Well, Steve, congratulations on the book, How I Found Myself in the Midwest, a memoir of reinvention. You can buy it on your screen, and we want to virtually thank Steve for his presentation. Good luck with the rest of the book tour, and see you soon.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks
Take
to
care.
Reinvention for having me. Have a great
Thank
day.
you. Bye.